Dr. Stephen Eisenman is our speaker today, and his position is a professor of art history at Northwestern University. He earned an MFA and Ph.D. from Princeton University. As an art historian, Dr. Eisenman has published extensively on 19th century painting and design, including his recent books, Paul Gauguin, Artist of Myth and Dream, Design in the Age of Darwin, and the Ecology of Impressionism. His forthcoming projects include the exhibition William Blake in the Age of Aquarius, opening at the Block Museum of Art in September of 2017, as well as a book titled William Morris, the Dissident Victorian. Dr. Eisenman's work, though, extends well beyond academia. As an activist, he has spoken out for human and animal rights on a variety of fronts. In his 2007 book, The Abu Ghraib Effect, Stephen considers the images of tortured prisoners within the context of art history and investigates our ability as viewers to rationalize imagery that might otherwise directly challenge our morality. In 2008, Dr. Eisenman joined forces with an organization called Tamms Year 10, working to end torture and ultimately close down Illinois' most notorious supermax prison. More recently, he has written a considerable amount about the plight of animals in the modern era. His books, The Cry of Nature and The Ghosts of Our Meat, explore how artists since the Enlightenment have dealt with the question of the animal in their work and what they tell us about our relationship to the natural world. In each instance, Dr. Eisenman gives voice to the voiceless and asks if we are listening. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Eisenman.
I've been teaching art history for about 35 years, first at Occidental College, that's a small liberal arts school in Los Angeles, and then at Northwestern since 1998, as you know, a large university. Never have I found art and art history students more anxious than now to answer the question, how do I do my art or my scholarship and also be a political activist? How can I synthesize them and be true to both those things? Now, these are good questions, and I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar right now called Art, History, and Activism to try to address some of them. And at the end of the semester, I'll send David the results of our work, our joint work, and he can report to you guys as to what we've come up with. My students, however, in general, don't ask the most fundamental questions, and that is, what are the big issues with which I should be most engaged? They feel the anxieties of the age, the economic insecurity of the present time, that is what we might call the rule of the 1%. They've been concerned about war and terrorism, racial tensions arising from police shootings and mass incarceration, and looming above it all, the threat of environmental destruction and global warming. Parenthetically, of course, people are concerned now in this election year. It's raised a lot of tensions in general. In the debates, global warming hasn't been mentioned once. It's stunning. But now, get back to my question about how students deal with these things. They generally don't think about these issues together, or they don't have a way to synthesize them. That's what I want to do a little bit with you today, is to describe a particular synthesis that's important to me, and that may stimulate you to think broadly and critically about the world and the impact that you will have upon it as you go forth from College of DuPage and continue your careers in education or in the professions or wherever else. Along the way, I'm going to make references to a number of works of art, both historical and recent, that have become touchstones for me in my recent work. This isn't really an art history talk, it's a more broader history of ideas talk, but the works of art which I'll discuss along the way, and you'll see the value that art history can have in studying and asking these big questions. So first, my paper is called Socialism and Animal Liberation, a necessary synthesis for artists and art historians. And the first section, proper then, is called Socialism. Socialism is an economic and political order that sets common needs above private desires, and that values people over the things that they make or they sell. In that broad sense, it's an idea as old as humans themselves. Our forager or hunter-gatherer ancestors, people who lived the first 100,000 years or so of modern human history, they were socialists. They had no conception of private property, they disdained greed, and they honored each other and their environment. Why hoard when the world was so bountiful? Why vaunt the sense of having when the sense of wonder yielded so much greater delights? Why treat other people and non-human animals as mere things when their kinship is so clear? But then agriculture, private property, and the nation state appeared. The actual history of all this is long, complex, and debated. You may be studying in some of your classes, but the results were clear. Hierarchy deposed equality, and accumulation displaced sharing. Personal or dynastic wealth changed from being exceptional occurrences to high principles, and socialism in its many forms became a radical idea, even a dangerous one. During the reign of Henry VIII, the heyday of mercantile capitalism, when wealth was accumulated at a faster rate than ever had been before, Thomas More explained socialism in his book Utopia, and I show a plate from the book Utopia from 1516. He described an island whose inhabitants work at trades that bring them pleasure, sleep a full 8 hours every night, and have abundant time for relaxation, chiefly reading, attending lectures, and discussing ideas. Sounds like a college campus, a good college campus. The fact that the book was published in Latin may have protected its author from attack. There's Thomas More. He was beheaded in 1535 for refusing to accept the supremacy of the English crown over the Church of Rome. Not for his book, but the Utopia had already earned him lots of enemies. The artist Ambrosius Holbein, who made this map for the 1519 edition, may have realized the risk that More was taking. His island takes the form of a memento mori, that is a skull or death's head. If you look at the map with slightly squinted eyes, you'll see that the bottom right looks like a jaw with teeth, and the shape of the island with that round is a crescent-shaped island, looks like the top of a skull, and the middle of it is his eyes. So it's like a death's head, a skull, and that would be considered a memory or a thought about death. It reminded me of a work by his brother, Hans Holbein. This is called The Ambassadors, and at the bottom of the canvas is a head, a skull also, in a form of an anamorphosis. That is, it's a form that becomes fully rounded when you see it from the side. You can see the skull, but it has a kind of trick. It becomes three-dimensional when you look at it from the side. So they're both concerned with these issues of the omnipresence of death, but as I say, I think it may have had a particular poignancy in the case of Thomas More. Now, English radicals of the following century, who were called the true levelers, that is of the 17th century, the true levelers, the ranters, the diggers, and other radical dissenting groups, also embraced socialism. Gerard Winstanley, the levelers' spokesman, the leveler, the name itself implies that they wanted to level society, that is, to have everybody be equal. The levelers' spokesman proclaimed that the earth was a common storehouse for everyone, labor for wages was a curse, and that landlords and oppressors had to be stamped out. He also said that animals, no less than humans, bore the imprint of God. The movement of the levelers was defeated, but the idea was picked up a century or so later by the poet William Blake. Here's a plate from Blake's book, America, A Prophecy. Blake, of course, famously wrote, "Everything that lives is holy." And he meant animals as well as humans, plants, everything. And you see in this plate, of course, these two lovers on the ground, one on top and one below, sleeping sheep, as if they're one gigantic animal. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau invoked socialist principles in his book on the discourse of the origins of inequality, and his ideas in turn impacted people during the French Revolution, including a man named Gracchus Babeuf, who led a left-wing conspiracy of equals in 1796. He proclaimed, quote, "Nature has given to every man the right to the enjoyment of an equal share in all property." Babeuf unfortunately shared the fate of More. He too was beheaded. Socialism and its equally radical corollary, democracy, ruled by the people, thus represented at the time of the French Revolution the principle that workers and peasants had as much moral and social worth as their class superiors, and they had a right to the bounty of the earth too. By the middle of the 19th century, the word socialism and sometimes the word communism was widely deployed, and a raft of politicians and philosophers wrote about it, including, of course, Karl Marx. His book, Das Kapital, Capital, was a full-fledged theory of capitalism that contained within it an implicit and sometimes explicit theory of socialism. And of course, he wrote the Communist Manifesto, a text intended to propel the movement towards socialism. In the same year as the Communist Manifesto, the painter J.F. Millet, here, who supported the French Revolution of 1848, showed French peasants as noble, independent figures in this picture of the potato harvesters. A year later, the artist Gustave Courbet, in his picture The Stonebreakers, showed peasants turned into proletarians. People who once owned land and did farming, now made to do back-breaking work, breaking stones on the side of a road. People who own nothing but their labor power. That's what a proletarian is. Socialism in greater or lesser form came to be embraced by the end of the 19th and early 20th century by most European and many other nation states, and particularly in the decades following World War II. The preservation of social peace and the survival of capitalism depended upon the endorsement of a certain element of socialism. Socialism, you could say, and capitalism grew up together in the 20th century. We see something of the echoes of that in the great mural painting in Detroit by Diego Rivera showing workers on the Ford River Rouge assembly line. Workers gained union rights in the 20th century, auto workers did, and socialism advanced quite far. The degree of its advancement is in direct proportion, of course, to the power of its working class. In the United States, Social Security, 1935, the Federal Air Traffic Control Act, 1936, the Interstate Highway System, 1956, and Medicare, 1966, are all expressions of socialist principle. These were general, nationalized endeavors that gave property and rights to a broad swath of people. What would we do without Social Security, without federal air traffic control? These are things that work very well, and these are all socialist programs. These are services provided by the people, for the people, with the state acting as intermediary without regard for profit. Obamacare, by the way, is not an example of socialism because, unlike Medicare, it relies on a private insurance system. Now, however ingrained in the fabric of economic life socialism is today, it remains nevertheless still only a seed within the carapace of capitalism. Large monopolistic private corporations, supported by laws and regulations that protect them from both competition and from workers, dominate the production and distribution of goods and services in the United States and abroad. Another reason that socialism is so limited here is ideological. Marx wrote in 1845, quote, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, that those who have the preponderance of money and power have the loudest voices. They own the mass media, for example, and they use their loud voices to uphold the moral worth of private riches above public goods." Until this election, anyway, I'd say, most people in the United States kind of love rich people. They go, "Oh, I want to be like that. I can be like that." And that feeling, in spite of all the evidence that the chances of you becoming a billionaire are 1,000,000,000 to 1, nevertheless, people think that they can be this way. And that's something to do with the dominance of the media by people who are billionaires. There are indications, however, that socialism, as I'm describing it, may be gaining ground. After the global economic crisis of 2007 to 9, known as the Great Recession, capitalism lost its aura of inevitability. The Occupy movement of 2011, short-lived as it was, alerted working people in Europe and the United States to the unexampled scale of wealth and income inequality. However inexact the term the 1% may be, it was an effective descriptor of the small percentage of people who possess the wealth that should belong to the 99% who created it. The slogan, "We are the 99%, therefore didn't refer only to the vast majority of people denied resources held by the few. It also suggested the incipient power that resided in the force of numbers. During the U.S. Democratic Party primary elections of 2016, just this year, Bernie Sanders even dared to endorse the term socialist. He said, "I'm a socialist." Previously anathema, impossible for U.S. politicians. He didn't win, but he got pretty far. Given the growth of global inequality and the persistence of economic stagnation, and considering the popular insurgencies that have risen to challenge them, socialism has a potentially bright future. Indeed, it may be the planet's only future. Prevention of global warming beyond the 2 degrees Celsius tipping point, that's the point beyond which there'll be a set of natural processes that cannot be reversed, leading to the warming of oceans, the melting of the ice caps, changes of currents within the ocean and the atmosphere that will then lead to still further warming and tremendous rises in sea level, etc. In order to prevent warming beyond the 2 degrees Celsius tipping point, massive state intervention into the economy will be required. The wealth of the few, the managers and shareholders of oil companies, utilities, automobile and airplane manufacturers, and animal agriculture, the needs of those people will have to be sacrificed for the good of the many. In other words, the regime of socialism, its precise shape and form as yet unknown, will have to be established if a habitable planet is to be salvaged. But that transformation won't happen by itself. It will require popular mobilization and major changes in the politics, ethics, and practice of everyday life. It will require both that people who possess wealth share with those who don't, and that the majorities of people in the most highly industrialized countries agree to conserve the ecological diversity of the planet. In short, people will need to become a bit more like early foragers, hunter-gatherers, albeit at a technically advanced stage of development, if they are to become successful citizens and socialists. Only then will the risk to the planet be reduced and human survival assured. Part 2, animal liberation, and they will follow a kind of synthesis of the first two parts, socialism and animal liberation. Animal liberation is the title of a popular book from 1975 by the philosopher Peter Singer. It's also the general name for a social movement that proposes to free animals from human oppression. The idea, if not the term, has been around at least since Greco-Roman antiquity. Indeed, early 19th century vegetarians were sometimes called Pythagoreans in remembrance of the ancient mathematician Pythagoras. Remember his theorem, Pythagorean theorem? Pythagoras, who abjured meat, rejected meat because of his belief in the transmigration of souls. But animal liberation is also an umbrella term beneath which are found three other things which I'm going to describe to you. The first is animal welfare, the second is animal rights, the third is animal abolitionism. Each of these has its own meaning, which has led to a splintering of the broader animal liberation struggle. So again, animal liberation, beneath that are three subsets which I'm going to describe to you: animal welfare, animal rights, and animal abolitionism. So first, animal welfare, sometimes also called animal protection. It promotes a paternalistic model of human-animal affairs, that is, seeing animals in a way as children, and we are the parents who take care of it. It says that people owe a duty of kindness to animals, even if the former people still own, use, and even kill animals. The argument for animal welfare goes back to the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. He argued that just as enlightened people recognized that skin color was meaningless for the determination of moral worth, so they would soon understand that possessing a tail or having fur was insignificant for the determination of rights. What mattered most of all was the capacity to suffer, and in that animals were equal to humans. Animals suffer. We should not accept the suffering of people, nor should we accept the suffering of animals, so our treatment of animals has to change. But while Bentham believed that humans and animals had the right to be spared pain, he nevertheless asserted that animals had a lesser claim on life itself. Because animals, unlike humans, can't imagine the future, he said, they have less to lose from an early death, so long as that death is not painful. Indeed, to be quickly killed in a slaughterhouse was a death much preferred to the drawn-out agonies that often attend human passing. So according to Bentham, animals are in some ways lucky because they get killed quickly and painlessly, he said, in a slaughterhouse, whereas humans may suffer from a terrible disease and be in agonies for months or years even. Bentham's argument, essentially repeated by Peter Singer in that book, Animal Liberation, to me is an odd one. Apart from the suggestion, absurd on its face, that animals are lucky to be eaten, it denies what everyone who lives with a cat or a dog understands implicitly, that animals live in a constant expectation of future joys. A dog who sits all day by the door waiting for a human companion to return, or brings a favorite toy for play, or who yips in excitement when brought to proximity of a dog park, is expressing hope for the future. Few humans, really, are much more future-oriented than this themselves. Their focus may be on tonight's football game, the coming weekend off from work, the beer party, seaside holiday, all those kinds of things. We're rather limited in our expectations of the future, maybe not much different than dogs in that regard. Animal welfare was the basis for the creation of animal protection societies in Europe and America, beginning with the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals in 1824. It remains the principle underlying most contemporary animal charities, including the Humane Society, Farm Sanctuary, and PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Okay, so much for animal welfare. Next one, animal rights. Again, all this underneath the umbrella of animal liberation more broadly. Animal rights. Animal rights concerns itself with the legal and ethical apparatus that structures human-animal relations. Proponents of the doctrine of animal rights generally seek to use the existing state, its executive, legislative, and judicial branches, to moderate or even end the oppression of animals. They believe that animals possess certain negative rights, for example, the right not to be confined, not to be tortured, and not to be killed, those negative rights that must be respected even if they conflict with human prosperity. The English artist William Hogarth explored these rights in the middle of the 18th century in a series of engravings. These are a set of engravings that Hogarth made in the middle of the 18th century in order to demonstrate the cruelty of humans towards animals in the city of London, which he loved and which was his home for his whole life. And the first plate, called The First Stage of Cruelty, shows a young man in a kind of ragged costume in the middle who is sticking an arrow into the anus of a dog. And then you'll see various other cruelties all around the picture. So you can see in the bottom right, a young boy tying a bone to the tail of a dog to try to get the dog to chase his tail. And then at the top left, you see some scoundrel boys who've tossed a cat out of a window with a balloon attached to it to see if it'll fly. And then in the middle is some other people have strung up a cat upside down to torment it. And then you see in the middle right some boys with a little bird, and they're poking out the eyes of the bird to see if it'll make it sing sweeter, which was a common misunderstanding about songbirds. There's a second plate that shows the same character we saw in the first. This time he drives a carriage, and we see him flogging his horse, who's broken down under the heavy weight of his passengers. The passengers are all lawyers, dressed up in their typical costume, and they were too cheap to get several carriages, and so they all piled into the one, and you can see the poor horse has broken his leg, the lower left, and there's a tear dripping from the horse's eyes. And at the lower right, you see a drover, somebody who moves animals through the streets of London, clubbing a sheep who's been moving too slowly in the head. And in the back, you see some people chasing after a cow and tormenting it, and so on. Then the third, which is called Cruelty and Perfection. The animals are absent here, but can you see what's happened? The same character in the middle now has been apprehended. What has he done? Say it out loud.
Assaulted her.
Exactly, assaulted. He's killed his girlfriend. You can see he cut her throat. Look at this big slit in her throat. And the idea here, of course, is that the man who was an animal abuser in his childhood has grown up to be a killer, and that there's a natural progression from one to the other, which we know from research these days. The surest sign of a psychopath is somebody who tortures animals as a child. Then finally, the reward of cruelty. Here, the criminal has been executed. He's lying at a dissecting table, and an anatomy teacher is slicing him up to show the students all around. And there's a dog in the bottom chewing on the heart, sort of getting a bit of revenge, you could say. And this is what happens. Hogarth thought this was one of his most important series of prints, and he wanted to make that a lesson, and he identified himself very much with animals. And we see Hogarth in a self-portrait with his dog. His dog, oddly, for this election year, is named Trump. Trump is also, it's a shame, a perfectly good word, Trump. Like in my writing, I'll say, this trumps that, because Trump is also, when you play cards, bridge, Trump is the card that beats another card. So you could say, I trump this, I beat that. Perfectly good word in the language, ruined. And this poor dog now, I was going to name my next dog Trump. I've always wanted to name a dog Trump. I shouldn't say next dog, my dog Echo gets upset, she's 10. There will be an Echo, unless she dies, unless I die before her, there'll be another dog. And I started to name it Trump, but no more. Anyway, but it's a remarkable painting because you can see it isn't really a self-portrait at all. It's actually a still life with a portrait of Trump, because the self-portrait is on a canvas placed within the picture. You see? So it's an object, a painting, placed within a scene, and the real portrait is of his dog. It's a wonderful, loving thing. So, back to the theme of animal rights, which I think is one of the themes of Hogarth's work. Contemporary animal rights advocates are very good at dismantling speciesism. That's a good word for you all, speciesism. That is the unreasoned prejudice of humans against animals. And sometimes animal rights advocates are good at conjuring a picture of what a future animal liberation will look like. Some people have theorized that, for example, we'll live in a world where, say, squirrels and raccoons and other animals who are sort of semi-wild, semi-domesticated, will have quasi-citizenship rights, and domestic animals will have certain very particularly designated rights, positive rights, you could say. The result of all this, in their theorizing, would be a kind of human-animal cooperative community that resembles More's utopia. I just show here for whimsy a woodcut by Sucot showing a kind of utopian scene of animals together. They're all bundled up in bed together and the covers. Now, many mainstream animal rights advocates, however, offer little guidance as to how to achieve that liberation, and their positions ultimately may differ very little from the welfarists. So let me turn finally then to the abolitionist position before I make a synthesis of my ideas about socialism and animal liberation. Abolitionism is the more controversial than the other two. It means the end of all ownership and use of animals for food, clothing, medical research, service, guide dogs, pets, or anything else. The idea has ancient roots and non-European ones as well. It goes, for example, the religion of Jainism, established 2,000 years ago and practiced by about 5 million people today, mostly in India, has non-violence toward animals as one of its core principles. I visited the Jain Bird Hospital in New Delhi, and it's a remarkable place. I just show a photograph of it here. It's a place where thousands of pigeons, for example, who were injured by traffic or anything else, are brought in and kept in little boxes first while they recuperate a little bit, and then they're fed, and then they're brought into a larger container and ultimately rehabilitated and let back into the world. The modern origin of abolitionism, like the modern origin of socialism, may be traced to the 18th century. At that time, however, the word was used mostly to describe the movement for the emancipation of African slaves and the end of the slave trade. But a host of essayists and poets in late 18th century harbored both animal and human abolitionist sentiments. They included the poets William Blake and Percy Shelley and the English Jacobin John Oswald. They were motivated by two mutually supporting ideas. First, that human and non-human animals alike possess the same capacity to suffer, an idea derived from Bentham. And second, that economic development, what we would now call industrial capitalism, led to great misery among the classes of artists and artisans, women and children, unemployed and homeless, mentally ill and disabled, slaves, former slaves, and animals. They all were equally oppressed by this new system of industrial capitalism. So if suffering was a thing to be avoided, and who was so cold-hearted as to disagree, and if capitalist industry and trade hurt all the above-mentioned groups, then human and animals shared a common political goal, the transformation of society from one based on slavery, oppression, and private profit to one that prizes equality, democracy, and the free exercise of the physical and mental faculties of every sentient being. In 1796, William Blake illustrated John Stedman's anti-slavery text called The Narrative of a 5 Years' Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname, and he illustrated it with a series of plates that exposed the terrible atrocities committed by plantation slaveries, including, as you see in this plate, titled A Negro Hung Alive by the Ribs to a Gallows. Less than a decade later, Blake wrote his Auguries of Innocence, a poem that specifically links animal cruelty to political cruelty and political misrule. Quote, a dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the roads calls to heaven for human blood. So all these indignities, cruelties toward animals require or have a corollary in human unfairness and cruelty. In 1813, Percy Shelley, the poet, included an incisive vegetarian animal rights treatise in his book, an utopian poem called Queen Mab. And I have a text for it up there. But he basically called out against the enslavement of animals and the cruel use of their bodies, their mutilation, their outraged and degraded feelings. The British Jacobin and anti-slavery crusader John Oswald wrote a book called The Cry of Nature, in which he argued in an abolitionist vein that the vegetable kingdom can supply all the food and other resources people need without any recourse to bloodshed against animals. He personified nature with this many-breasted figure, Pomona in the middle, asking humanity, quote, why shouldst thou dip thy hand in the blood of thy fellow creatures without cause? Have I not amply, not only for the wants, but even for the pleasures of the human race provided? So there's no need for bloodshed. And you should see here a deer who's looking at her slain fawn on the ground, and the text below crying out about the terror of the loss. Now, the leading global proponent of the abolitionist approach to animal liberation is the legal theorist Gary Francione. Building upon the ideas of both Singer and the philosopher Tom Regan, he argues that the capacity of a creature to experience pleasure or pain, that is, sentience, should be the basis for granting it moral status. But unlike them, he believes that sentience alone, regardless of an animal's intelligence or capacity to apprehend the future, is sufficient to grant them the rights to be free from human exploitation. So you don't have to be a great ape or even a dog to merit protection. Simply sentience, the capacity to experience pleasure or pain, is enough. He further argues that animals should no longer be considered, as slaves once were, mere chattels, property that could be freely moved from place to place, bought and sold. An abolitionist approach to animal rights thus demands an end to animals' property status. And that, of course, poses a profound challenge to the existing economic and social order. Animals are indispensable to many aspects of the U.S. and global economy, including food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, clothing, furniture, entertainment, healthcare, security, pet products, and veterinary services. Thus, to argue for abolition is also necessarily to argue for a massive reorientation of the economy toward the satisfaction of genuine human needs instead of the generation of profit. But Francione, like other animal rights advocates, can be faulted also for utopianism. That is, for not offering suggestions about how to achieve abolition apart from vegan education. So he's not really that clear about how we get from point A to point B. So let me then finally move to this question of a necessary synthesis between socialism and animal liberation. Whenever a particular animal liberation formulation is endorsed, any of the ones I've described, its defender must confront an historical paradox. At precisely a time in history when animal advocates are growing in numbers and influence, the global pace of animal exploitation has accelerated. The total zoomass, that is the weight or mass of all vertebrate animals bred for the table, is 25 times that of all wild vertebrates. There are in the world at any one time 19 billion chickens, 1.7 billion cattle, and 900 million pigs, compared, for example, to a vanishingly small number of elephants, rhinos, polar bears, tigers, gazelles, buffaloes, and other charismatic fauna. Animal agriculture constitutes 40% of the total value of global agriculture, not including fish. In the United States, it comprises about half the $850 billion contribution of agriculture to the annual gross domestic product. It accounts for 1/3 of all agricultural employment. Though the term factory farming is misleading, so-called family farms may also be large, intensive, and cruel. This is a drawing by Succo called Small Factory Farm. The modern practice of raising domesticated animals in conditions of maximum density is clearly the leading mode of animal agriculture in the world. Succo suggested in this drawing, Small Factory Farm, and also depicts it in this drawing called Gassing Hogs, using CO2 gas to kill large numbers of hogs in gas chambers before then cutting them open. More than 75% of poultry is raised in these kinds of large concentrated factory farms, and pigs also, and kept in so-called hog parlors. Though cattle farming is somewhat less rationalized than chicken and pig farming, the dairy industry and beef packing process are very highly mechanized. JBS Brazil, the largest meat processing company in the world, had revenues last year of $45 billion. It has a global cattle slaughtering capacity of more than 50,000 per day. Tyson Foods, headquartered in Springdale, Arkansas, and they also have a branch not too far from here, is the world's second largest meat producer with revenues of $32 billion. Smithfield kills 6 million chickens a day, 48,000 pigs, and 30,000 cows, and supplies meat to the largest U.S. grocery stores, including Walmart, IGA, Kroger's, and also to leading fast food chains, including McDonald's, KFC, Taco Bell, Wendy's, and Burger King. This, by the way, is another work by Succo. It's called Modern Man Followed by the Ghosts of His Meat. And you can see the figure at the lower right is holding his McDonald's bag And he's followed by all these animals who have died, haunting him. Tyson Foods gave a relatively modest $180,000 in political contributions in 2014, but it spent $1.5 million on lobbyists such as the American Meat Institute and the National Cattlemen's Association. Judging from data obtained from open source, their strategy is to affect legislation and regulation not by the scale of their spending, but by precisely targeting their contributions to influential lawmakers and regulators. Animal agriculture contributes somewhere between 14 and 51% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. These figures are in dispute. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization cites the lower figure of 14%, while the World Watch Institute the higher figure at 51%. The data discrepancy involves such things as animal respiration, the potency of methane and nitrogen versus carbon as greenhouse gases, the global population of livestock, the relative carbon absorption capacity of livestock, grassland and forests, etc. A careful review of the scholarship, which I've undertaken, suggests the figure is somewhere in between, perhaps 30% or 35%. The point is that the number is big, perhaps twice as big as the total greenhouse gas emissions from the global transport sector. I repeat, twice as big as the global transport sector is the CO2 released, or global warming gases, from animal agriculture. If we outlawed beef, we'd lower greenhouse gas emissions more than if we banned cars. Animal agriculture also causes deforestation, pollution to groundwater, lakes and rivers, the disappearance of wildlife, and the diminishment of water resources. Animal agriculture is the leading user of fresh water in the world, consuming 55 trillion tons annually. It consumes 520 times as much fresh water as the controversial and wasteful practice of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. A single pound of beef requires roughly 5,000 gallons of water to produce it. In addition to using moral suasion, therefore, any ambitious animal liberation campaign should highlight the devastating environmental consequences of animal agriculture. Just talking about our moral debt to animals suffering pain, is one thing, but the actual devastation that animal agriculture is having upon the planet is something else. Animal rights organizations need to target the meat industry and its complex web of political influence. In fact, however, the largest animal welfare organizations have barely touched, much less damaged, this elaborately interwoven corporate and governmental infrastructure. Animals, government work together, and the animal welfare organizations have hardly begun to attack them. Indeed, the Humane Society and Farm Sanctuary, among others, have actually partnered with agribusiness. And herein lies the reasons socialism must be part of the animal liberation movement, if the latter is to be effective. Existing property relations are the very things that make possible the exploitation of animals. Remember that discussion of Francione, that animals are treated as chattel, animals property. So long as animals are chattel, they can be used and abused at will, and genuine animal liberation will therefore require state intervention to curtail and ultimately end an industry that kills both domesticated and wild animals in obscene numbers and renders the environment increasingly unfit for humans. There can be no animal liberation without socialism. But socialism also needs the insights of organizing strategies of animal liberation, if it is ever to produce a system in which genuine human needs are being satisfied instead of corporate profits. Animal agriculture should be one of the first industries, along with energy and banking, in the crosshairs of socialism. It is a highly successful system for maximizing profit at the expense of labor. Its workers, that is, people in slaughterhouses, are among the worst paid in the United States, doing the most dangerous jobs. The average turnover in a meatpacking plant, annual turnover, is 100%. Animal agriculture stands as the textbook example of an industry that privatizes profits and socializes or externalizes costs. While corporations accrue vast sums through the sale of animal products of every kind, the public pays much of the price of the production in the form of polluted or depleted surface and groundwater, loss of biodiversity, poor public health, and a warming planet. Without that public subsidy, animal products would be prohibitively expensive for most people and thus therefore be unprofitable. The price of a McDonald's Big Mac, if all these externalities were figured in, would be closer to $9 or $10. Animal advocates can help socialists in their campaign for moral, economic, and political justice. Advocates for animal liberation can also help advance the core socialist values of generosity and sharing, while stigmatizing greed and selfishness. That's the very point of becoming a vegan. While eating a hamburger or a hot dog may be moderately pleasurable to some consumers, it depends upon the suffering and death of sentient beings like us. It also is an act of embodiment. Consuming the flesh of a formerly living animal makes the consumer physically and emotionally complicit in its killing, and therefore likely to be less resistant to other forms of plunder, either to other animals, the planet, or to ourselves. That one-way street of oppression and death must be closed off in order for people to become more fully understanding of the common needs of others like themselves and of the planet. More than ever before, animal liberation and socialism represent a necessary synthesis in conclusion. Any community concerned to protect animals from abuse or premature death must confront the enormous economic and political powers arrayed against them. And so it must therefore endorse the restraints on capital that socialism has consistently championed. And any socialist who would proclaim the virtue of reorienting production to the needs of the many versus the luxuries of the few must turn to animal liberators for a lesson in opposing greed and celebrating its opposite, the responsible stewardship of organic nature for the benefit of all the Earth's creatures and for the planet itself. Thank you. Mind you guys, I'm sure I've challenged or offended or excited a few of you. Yes?
What do you really feel that the role of art is in relation to the politic? How effectual do you think the art is?
Right.
Is there other ideas that you have that would make more effective politics around it?
It's a very good question about the role of art in all this. And the same question could be asked about any social or political struggle, whether it be socialism, animal liberation. And I guess my answer is that art is obviously an effective means of communication and self-expression. And it's a fundamental thing, art. It isn't simply that which we put off to the side to be seen in galleries. It's a thing we do at home when we draw, write, sing. These are all artistic productions. They are as essential to us as breathing, you could say. Creative work is what defines us as humans. So to set aside something so fundamental as our desires for to live in a just and sustainable world, to set that aside from the world of our creativity would be unimaginable, unthinkable. So it's more, in a way, I would put the question the other way. How can we produce works of art without also bringing in these other most fundamental aspects of our life? To create a community among our fellows is one of the things that, again, defines us as people. It has to be part of our creative endeavors as well, whether it be in visual arts, music, literature, or anything else.
So do you find when you're talking with your class, your graduate seminar about art and activism,
Yeah.
are you finding somehow there's a sense maybe that art is changing, that the action, almost the performance side of it, that's something beyond just something by Sukkot or a visual,
Right.
that it needs to become an
Yes.
action-oriented
Right.
art forms
Right.
as well as like the visual?
Right, absolutely. Art can comment upon the world, it can describe the world, but it also can engage the world, and it can be participate in the political arena. When I was working on the Tamms project, we were a group called Tamms Year 10, and our goal was to reform or to close this Supermax prison in southern Illinois in a town called Tamms. Supermax prison, for those of you who don't know, is a prison where men, it's almost always men in these Supermax prisons, are kept in perpetual solitary confinement. At Tamms, men were never in community with anybody else. They would exercise alone, they would get one shower a week alone, and they'd be in their cells, apart from the 1 hour of exercise, 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year, for years at a time. Obviously, it's soul destroying. So our goal was to try to end that, and we succeeded in doing so through lobbying campaigns. But it was also a work of art. The leader of the group was a woman named Laurie Jo Reynolds, and I worked very closely with her, and we did a kind of performative political engagement. Our protests were performances with costumes, with music. Even when we did lobbying in Springfield, we did so with a certain mind toward what the performance was like. We didn't sort of obey the rules that most political activists did. So we made of that a kind of performance piece. You know, some of the students will know the domain of art called performance art, where the person puts their body on a stage, not like exactly a theatrical performance, not really a work of visual art on a screen, but some combination of those things. So we did this as a kind of performance art. So yes, if you want to be really effective political players, you have to engage where the power is. And where the power is in Illinois is in Springfield with the State House, in the Capitol building. It's in your districts, in the district offices of your state representative, your state senator, the U.S. senator, the House of Representatives, the corporations. That's where the money is, that's where the power is, and that's where you have to be effective if you want to make change. And you can do so in an artistic way, and you can work at every level. You can work in the classroom, writing, making works of art, to communicate among yourselves, to keep up your morale, with posters, banners, performances, and then take it all the way into the state capital of Springfield or Washington or wherever else, always in their kind of creative way. It doesn't mean that all art that you produce, those of you who are art majors, I'm not calling for all of you to only make art about these political issues. There is a necessary space for one to produce something that's, if you will, purely out of yourself, if you will, art for itself alone. We have responsibility to think as freely and clearly and creatively and imaginatively as we possibly can. But as I say, because we live in the world, our imaginations are infused with all that's going on around us. It would be strange to censor that part of ourselves which is engaged with the exterior world when we're making art.
What kind of steps can we take as individuals or as groups towards the goal of a mass takedown of franchises as large as McDonald's?
Right. A very good question. What can we do as individuals or as groups to remove the power or to cut down the power of I'm going down to the mic here just because it's being recorded, an institution like McDonald's? Well, obviously, the first thing you do is to not eat at McDonald's. And that's an easy one. And not eat, and then not go across the street and walk at Taco Bell or KFC either. So veganism is a big step. Obviously, beyond that, you can organize other people to not eat at McDonald's and do that by online campaigns, in person, protests, rallies. There are smaller steps that people take. I know there's been a big online thing to get McDonald's to serve veggie burgers. I suppose that's one strategy. I'm not sure whether that's the most effective thing. It's simply another way for them to make more profit and to allow them to continue their main business, which is serving hamburgers. But I guess everybody ordered veggie burgers instead of hamburgers. That'd be something. I read yesterday in the New York Times that Tyson Foods has put a 5% share of, I forget the name of the company. It's a company that makes plant-based meat, like fake meat, like veggie burgers and stuff like that. What's that? Beyond Meat, exactly. I thought, wow, Tyson Foods, they are like the most evil of all. And they're buying a share in this company that makes, vegan food. I go, what does that mean? Does that mean they just see another profit opportunities? Does it mean they're trying to buy them in order to destroy them? I don't know what it means. It's interesting. So there may be lots of approaches to it. Organizing yourselves is the first thing. You're one person, you've got a voice, and if you stop eating hamburgers, that's something, but it's only a little tiny thing. But if the person next to you and the person next to her does this, that's something else. So talking to your fellow students is a great thing to do, to organize, organize. That's at the bottom of any political activity. Yeah.
So, do you think that realistically, starting from this day and age, and given all the sacrifices that we would have to make, that we could actually live harmoniously while enacting abolitionism, I think they called it?
Right. The question, if you didn't hear it, is in this day and age, given the circumstances, do you think we could actually create a regime of peaceful coexistence with animals and enact something like abolitionism? And my response is yes, I do think so. And the preservation of the planet requires it. And here's an example I give. When I was a kid, I'm 60. When I was a child, my mother, who was a smoker, used to send me down to the corner store to buy her cigarettes. So she'd say, honey, would you give me my Kent cigarettes? I go, okay, Mom. I'd say, well, I wish you'd quit. She'd, no. They didn't really know very much about cancer. It was already coming out, but not that much. So I'd go to the cigarette, and they'd sell it to me. It was not against the law to sell it to an 8-year-old kid. So I'd go buy the cigarettes, give it to her. Today, nobody would do that. If you were a mother who did that, you would be shunned. Not only that, but cigarette smoking has declined precipitously. Nobody's smoking in this room. When I was a college student, my professors would be in the room smoking. It's unimaginable. So, within a generation, things change very profoundly. And so I can imagine, in terms of the meat thing, within 30, 40 years, to eat a hamburger would be like smoking a cigarette today. There'll be people who go in the corner and they stand in front of the building and they've got their McDonald's like this, like that. And then other people are going, ooh, like walk around like that. Maybe little signs in front of the buildings saying, no hamburger eating here, there's a meat eating zone over there. So it may not be exactly bad, but it'd be kind of gross and really not. But it doesn't happen by itself. The cigarette thing happened because people who were dying of cancer made public service announcements, and laws were passed to put those warnings on the cigarette packs, and laws were passed and that you couldn't have smoking in public, and campuses passed no smoking zones and all that. So it can happen.
All right, so we're just about out of time.
Okay.
Thank you again, Stephen. Can we have a round?
You bet. Thank you.